This series of videos was built for games like Ebenezer and the Invisible World. Forget gun-toting crabs and buddy cop retro RPGs. Just kidding, you should totally check those videos out. This right here is the definition of a weird indie game. What you're looking at is a 2D action platformer Metroidvania-like that stars Ebenezer Scrooge, yeah, that Ebenezer Scrooge, fighting his way through the streets of London, slapping enemies with his walking cane, and summoning friendly spirits to perform special attacks, all within a very Christmas-themed backdrop. That concept alone should be enough to grab your attention because this is one of the most fantastically weird indie titles I've come across in a while. And I'm going to say this straight from the beginning here, this game needs a lot of work, and it has some flaws that I think are ultimately going to end up holding it back. But its framework is so unique, and it is so full of creative ideas and refreshing design that every indie or aspiring game developer needs to stop and take notice. Because after 5 minutes of playing this demo, there was a 0% chance that I was not going to feature Ebenezer and the Invisible World on this edition of Weird Indie Games. So the very first thing you'll see when you boot this game up is a quote from the original writing of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere, for good, in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Orbit Studio and Play on Worlds, Ebenezer's developers, essentially took this quote and turned it into an entire game. Ebenezer and the Invisible World takes place after the events of A Christmas Carol, featuring Scrooge as a newly reformed man who now makes it his mission in life to help others. Sorry if you've never seen or read one of the 100 adaptations of A Christmas Carol, but that's what happens. But as we soon find out, this version of Scrooge doesn't just help people by buying them turkeys or wishing them a happy Christmas, he helps people by slapping the shit out of evil spirits and/or aristocratic police forces. Okay, so during the introduction of the game, you're visited by a spirit who fills you in on the background of a wealthy, silk-stocking family who aspires to basically eliminate the London working class. The spirit recruits Ebenezer to help him solve this problem, the larger overarching template of a theme that you'll encounter several times over the course of the game. So after this intro, off you go, Ebenezer Scrooge, an old, feeble man roaming streets and cemeteries and sewers to help accomplish this noble goal. And it is awesome. Like, talk about taking an unorthodox theme and running with it. It's a little reminiscent of the soon-to-be-released Lies of P, which adapts the story and world of Pinocchio into a Souls-like formula, which is equally as cool of an idea. This is a wacky and welcome concept from front to back, because in this version of the Christmas Carolverse, Ebenezer is not an old feeble man, but an agile, graceful advocate for good who runs and leaps and thwacks with a flair that would make any Castlevania Belmont jealous. This is a very distinct looking game, combining vibrant, layered environments with cartoony looking characters and animations. Ebenezer the character is brightly colored and pops out on screen, and when he jumps, he looks like he's channeling his inner Superman, soaring through the cold London air. A lot of the animations are really fun, in fact, like here when a friendly spirit appears from these balloons to toss you higher upwards, resulting in Ebenezer conducting a flawless spin move. I think it's just really entertaining watching this character that's always portrayed as aging and grumpy be turned into someone who moves with the striking confidence of a classic video game hero. The true highlight of the art department, however, is without a doubt the creatively varied enemy designs. No joke, these are some of the best, most cleverly crafted enemies I've ever seen. Many of them taking characters from the lore who have passed on and reimagining them as spiritual manifestations of their defining characteristics. So you've got an uptight theater critic who throws tomatoes, a tightrope walker who hovers above you, chains materializing in front of her as she moves left to right, and a pair of ice skaters who dash together through the snow-covered streets. This might be the first game for which I've intentionally gone into the codex to read the descriptions of the enemies immediately after encountering them, because it's here you'll read about who these people were when they were living, and what flaws and downfalls led to them turning into haunted spirits. Take, for example, this sewer-dwelling creature right here, who you find out is actually a former mayor now weighed down by chains as a reminder of his corrupt political career in his previous life. So what you've got here is a developer who found an expressive way to take the sewer rat archetype found in other games like this and give it a real identity, backstory, and creative design, so he fundamentally functions the same as other rats in other games, but looks entirely unique and leaves a much more lasting impression. Maybe I'm overanalyzing this point, but I think this is just brilliant work across the board, honestly. And this is certainly not the only example of fun and inventive game design found in Ebenezer either. The combat here is most easily likened to something like Hollow Knight, with Ebenezer's wooden cane replacing the knight's nail. But this combat is given some variety through special attacks that call in friendly spirits you've encountered and helped in some way. So in the demo, you'll gain access to a soldier with an upward swiping attack, and a lamplighter who furiously spins his pole to create a damaging ring of fire. They're basically brief summon attacks similar to what we saw in Hi-Fi Rush earlier this year, a game that also put great effort into characterizing its special attacks. So it's nothing we haven't seen before, but the delicate care taken towards tying these attacks into the game world makes them feel a little more impactful. As described in the introductory quote, these are ghosts who can't directly impact the human world the way they want to, so they agree to instead make a difference by joining you on your journey. The side quests are also an interesting part of this game that, quite honestly, I wasn't expecting to see. And while I'm not totally sold on them being a worthwhile addition just yet, some of them do show the potential to be surprisingly memorable. Like when you encounter this ghost, who used to be a rich fashionista and now wants you to go purchase her most beautiful dress and gift it to a young girl she saw window shopping earlier. This character is not one that experiences some eye-opening epiphany the way that Scrooge does in A Christmas Carol, but rather one that clumsily works out the fact that doing this good deed might in fact be satisfying. It's a nice touch that helps to give these spirits their own identities, separate from just being a ghost seeking redemption. So from a creative direction standpoint, it's undeniable that Ebenezer in the Invisible World is heading in the right direction. It's frankly hard to ignore all of the fresh takes this game has on a pretty saturated genre at this point. But as I mentioned at the top of this video, there's still a lot of pieces in this game that need some serious work. Fortunately, many of these are relatively small things that can certainly be cleaned up before the full release of the game. Parts of the UI, like the map screen, need some attention to make it less bland and more informative. The text wrapping and dialogue boxes has a hitch that needs fixing. I can only assume that the game just doesn't have a completed soundtrack yet at this state, and I encountered some kind of bug a few times during which my attack input wouldn't register when standing right next to enemies. And not to pile on, but that's just a sample of the many minor issues and quality of life changes that need some attention. There's two larger issues, however, that to me felt like the pieces that are ultimately going to hold Ebenezer back from vaulting into the upper echelon of Metroid-inspired games. And unfortunately, these problems are pretty well baked into the foundation of the game, so I wouldn't expect them to see many changes for the final version. First, I'll mention the art style, which, although features some outstanding individual components, lacks a cohesion connecting all of those pieces together. Most of the characters look great on their own. Most of the environments look great on their own. But those two elements almost feel like they were designed for two different games. It's almost like the character artists and the environment artists were both given the description of the game. They each came up with a wonderful idea of how to express that description, but they never met in the middle to discuss how to blend those ideas together. So you end up with these fantastical, often cartoony characters and enemies who are placed onto a landscape that at times almost reaches for a more realistic version of its world. If this sounds picky, let me explain how these choices also lead into the second issue I found with Ebenezer. You know the common complaint of modern open-world games about how they have these massive environments but nothing interesting filling the space within them? What we see in Ebenezer feels like a version of that. As of now, many of the environments feel like a large box with a bunch of assets plopped down into it. And even though these assets may be thoughtfully placed in a lot of cases, that careful design can't overcome the sheer amount of empty space that's available. The best way I could think to describe it is that everything in the world feels like it should be physically condensed into a smaller area. Right now, everything feels very slow-paced, and trekking back and forth between areas feels like a chore. There's a sparseness here that I rarely experience in some of the great titles of this genre. Ebenezer doesn't seem to adopt the deliberate density applied to those games, and it ultimately ends up hurting this one quite a bit. Still though, even with these issues persisting, I'd totally recommend that you try out the demo for Ebenezer and the Invisible World. It's a more than competent game that has a super unique look, combat that feels tight and features some interesting highlights, and some outstanding creative design choices you're unlikely to find anywhere else. Most importantly though, I think the lasting legacy of this game will be teaching us the lesson that there is inspiration everywhere. In the world of game development, no idea is too off the wall, and I truly believe that nearly any initial concept can be molded into a viable game that engages players in ways they may not have thought possible. Ebenezer and the Invisible World certainly falls into that category of games, and it's great to see a fresh take on a classic tale in this fashion. And it's equally as satisfying to see Ebenezer Scrooge continue his redemption arc in a fucking video game. What a time to be alive.